Russia, the largest country in the world by area, has never been a populous country despite its size. With a population of 147 million according to its own official figures and 144 million according to foreign sources, it is 20 million less populous than Bangladesh, which is about 115 times smaller in area. These are good times for the Russians because they face a much more troubled future. In this video, we take a closer look at Russia's biggest future problem. From the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, to the present day, Russia has population statistics that are unparalleled anywhere else. These statistics in no way correspond to the figures of developed or developing countries. Russia's mortality rate is very high compared to countries in its class. The birth rate is also very low. In addition, the mortality rate is strikingly high, especially among the working male population. They are in the midst of a problem that raises alarm bells. The last census in Soviet Russia was conducted on January 12, 1989, and the population of the Soviet Union peaked at 147,022,000. In today's Russia, after the census conducted in 2002, it was determined that its population has fallen to 145,274,000. In the census of 2010, the decline continued, and it was found out that 142,905,000 people live in the country. According to the new census conducted in 2022, Russia's official figures say that 147 million people live in the country. However, foreign sources also claim that it is about 144 million. I will explain the reason for this controversial figure in a moment. According to international reports, if they do not take the necessary measures, their population will fall below 140 million by 2036. According to the United Nations, it is expected to fall below 108 million by 2050. According to the worst-case scenario of their own reports, they could be facing a country with a population of 83 million in 2050. The last years of the Soviet Union, its collapse, and the period of about 20 to 25 years after the collapse until Vladimir Putin came to power are described in history books as Russia's most difficult years, both economically and in terms of quality of life. And yet, in the midst of such a Great Depression, the population declined by only 2 million people. But in the so-called revival of Russia under Putin, from the 2000s to the mid-2010s, their population declined by more than 2 million. And it was during this period that more than 10 million of the approximately 25 million ethnic Russians who lived in the other countries that made up the Soviet Union immigrated to Russia. Since Russia is an authoritarian and partially closed state around Putin, the official figures should be treated with skepticism, as in many countries with authoritarian governments. This is also the reason for the controversial figures. While the official Russian authorities say that Russia has a population of 147 million, foreign organizations say that the population is between 144 and 146 million. The main reason for the varying numbers is the ease of naturalization and the distribution of Russian passports to many people in the former Soviet Union. They have added more than 20 new categories to the criteria for who can hold a Russian passport and have simplified the process. There is a joke that they will give citizenship to almost anyone who speaks Russian. Of course, there are as many people emigrating from Russia as are being brought in and added to the population, and their numbers are growing. Especially with the invasion of Ukraine, skilled Russians who do not want to live in a country isolated from the world are immigrating en masse. It is estimated that more than 20 million Russians have immigrated since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. On the other hand, Russia is trying to increase its influence on the population, especially in neighboring countries, by facilitating dual citizenship. For example, the Russian population in Donbass, which was used as a justification for the invasion of Ukraine, is mostly a mass created through the distribution of passports. They also use this method in countries like Moldova and Georgia through Transnistria. In order not to lose their sovereignty over the former Soviet countries, they justify the Russian population they created with the passports they distributed in these countries. They are also trying to attract qualified workers from these economically difficult countries to Russia under good conditions. Russia has a serious population problem, not only in general, but also in terms of distribution within the country. About 80% of the country's population lives west of the Ural Mountains, i.e. in the region within the European continent. Moscow and St. Petersburg are the most populous cities. The area south of Moscow to the Black Sea coast, also known as the Volga Federal District, is the next most densely populated. Less than 20% of the total population lives in the Far Eastern and Siberian federal districts, east of the Ural Mountains, where 2/3 of Russia's territory is located. One of the things Russia is doing to prevent internal problems caused by depopulation is to assimilate minorities and autonomous republics. The policy of assimilation is one of the most important issues for Vladimir Putin. He wants to do what Russian statesmen have wanted to do since the Soviet Union, but have never succeeded. For about 15 years, they have been trying to increase the Russian population and decrease the local population in autonomous republics and regions where minorities live together. They changed the constitution to include the article Russia was founded by Russians, not by other nationalities. They are rapidly taking over all legal, economic, and other rights of the 22 autonomous republics named after ethnically different nations. They put an end to mother tongue education in these autonomous states. They confiscated 70% of their revenues. Against all these policies of assimilation, the minorities did not raise their voices much. There were few protests. Only the Chechens rose up against Russian assimilation and domination. There, too, they brought to power Ramazan Kadyrov, who was not liked by the Chechen people and was known to be pro-Russian. The Russians are also creating new ethnic names to divide some ethnic groups within the country. On the other hand, Russia, which has a serious population problem, borders China, the country with the largest population in the world. The two countries share a 4,300-kilometer border. About 300 million people live in settlements on the Chinese side of this border. It is estimated that 6.5 million Chinese, including 1.5 million legal residents, live in Russia. While the Russians are experiencing internal migration to the west due to economic problems, the Chinese are settling in the places vacated by the Russians. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and Russia's opening to the world, Chinese merchants developed intensive trade relations with Siberia and Manchuria. In cities such as Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, Irkutsk, Ulan-Ude, and Novosibirsk, the Chinese have taken over much of the trade and service sectors. These regions, far from Moscow, the center of Russia, are almost entirely dependent on the Chinese population and Chinese trade for their livelihood. In addition, some senior American officials have occasionally made interesting statements about Siberia, one of the most sparsely populated regions in the world. Despite its rich underground resources, Siberia has a very small population, and the majority of this population is not of Russian ethnic origin. Former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, for example, said in 2005, "It is unfair that a region as large as Siberia should belong to a single country, that Russia should be the sole beneficiary of its riches. The region should be under the control of an international power." Condoleezza Rice, also a former Secretary of State, said, "Siberia is too big to be the territory of a single state." The Ural Mountains form a border not only between Europe and Asia, but also between the levels of development within Russia, with Europe, the western part, dominating. The Russian state is trying to facilitate and encourage the resettlement of ethnic Russians from Central Asian countries to the depopulated Far East and Siberia. No matter how many measures the state takes, the solutions to Russia's declining population and growing demographic problems are insufficient. The declining population and internal migration to the western part of the country pose a serious threat to Russia's security and integrity. If we take a closer look at the details that led to the decline of the Russian population, apart from immigration. First of all, despite the so-called revival, the income level of the Russian people is low. For this reason, they are deprived of such details as healthy food, healthy living, and care for personal health. In addition to this health and nutrition problem, the alcohol problem also has a profound impact. Over 200,000 people, mostly men, die every year in Russia because of alcohol. In addition, the widespread adoption in Russia of the low birth rate family system, which is now standard in the world, prevents them from preventing population loss. Government incentives do not help to increase the birth rate either. According to the World Bank, the birth rate per woman in Russia is about 1.5. This rate should be 2.2 just to keep the population at today's level. The root of this population problem is thought to lie in the bitter legacy of World War II. The Russians lost about 27 million people in that war. 2 generations of men were completely wiped out. As the death toll rose, young men were driven to the front lines, leaving no babies to carry on the generations. Because of this so-called war echo, women still outnumber men in Russia and some of the former Soviet countries.